new vaccine they would have the right to exploit by themselves. Can you all hear me? Because I can't see you because of the presentation, and you can see the presentation. Hello?
Yes.
Yes, Professor, perfectly. Yes.
Okay, very good. So at least I know, because it's a bit weird. I can't see you because it's gone into both screens. Okay. So we have these patent laws which protect their intellectual property and their ability to effectively make profits from these vaccinations. Now, the costs of the vaccine, here's a table just of a few of them, but you can see they range from the very expensive Moderna vaccine all the way to the relatively cheap Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, largely due to, we understand, negotiations between Oxford and AstraZeneca to make sure that this was accessible to more people. Okay? So I need to first situate this question, right, that we're going to be discussing today. And the first part is, what are the fundamental rights obligations of pharmaceutical manufacturers in relation to the vaccine? And there are a range of sub-questions, right? Do the companies have any obligations in relation to fundamental rights? That's the first prior question. I'm not going to focus on that question, okay? It can also be phrased, by the way, as a question about whether states should impose obligations on such companies. That is often the way of phrasing it in international law, that states have an obligation to protect individuals against harm or to ensure that companies realize their obligations. Okay, I won't focus on the question of are there obligations. I'm going to assume there are obligations. And so the next question is going to be, what are those obligations, right? So there are a number of possibilities. And the two main categories I'm going to discuss, right, and focus on one of them is on negative obligations not to harm rights. And here pharmaceutical companies, in this case, are not causing the COVID-19 harm, right? They presumably did not develop the virus and release it in the world. We know that that's a conspiracy theory that might, at some point be engaged with, but that's not the case, right? Pharmaceutical companies, as far as we know, did not cause the COVID-19 harm. Therefore, they don't really have negative obligations not to harm the rights. The focus of our attention in this question is on the positive obligations of these corporations actively to help realize rights and enable people to have vaccines, okay? And we're going to focus on that positive obligation actively to provide, right? Now, obviously, there's some degree to which this distinction is fuzzy. Omissions to provide actually cause harm to people's rights. Okay, so I don't think this distinction between negative and positive is as strong as it could be, and it doesn't hold up fully. But nevertheless, I will focus on the question of the duty actually to provide, which is often seen as the harder question. Most people accept that corporations can't harm rights, but do they actually have to help realize those rights? Okay. So if they have positive obligations, then what are those obligations? And for our purposes today, I'm going to simplify it into three parts. Number one, to provide the vaccine for free, right? One possibility. To provide the vaccine at a level affordable to countries around the world, okay? Accepting that this might involve different pricing for different countries, okay? That's one possibility. We call it differential pricing. And those are two alternatives. And the third question is, what are the obligations to ensure there is an adequate supply of the vaccine, which is one of the massive problems the world is facing at the moment, okay? So I'm going to focus today on the positive obligations of corporations. I told you about where the question sits. I'm going to provide you with what I call an analytical framework for thinking about these obligations. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that pharmaceutical companies have an obligation to do two things: to price the vaccine at a level affordable to all countries around the world, okay? Accepting that this may involve different prices for different countries, and to ensure there is an adequate supply, which means seriously ramping up production and could be done in two ways. It could involve granting licenses to other companies to manufacture, or accepting restrictions on their own intellectual property rights, right? Now, it may be that companies do not accept those obligations, but states should then enforce them, in my view. Okay, so let's get going. That's where we're going today and what the thrust of what I'm going to argue. Okay, the first thing we need to do is situate the question a little bit more. The question can be phrased as a moral question. What should society expect of the corporations? But it is also a legal question. What does the law require? Now, this is obviously a complicated issue about the relationship between law and morality. In my view, fundamental rights essentially are urgent moral demands that demand legal institutionalization, right? That's a complex claim which I cannot aim to justify now. You can read about it in my article in the Human Rights Quarterly about how fundamental rights bridge the relationship between morality and law. Okay, so my engagement today will straddle the boundary of both. Fundamental rights, I shall argue, require that corporations have positive obligations, and if such positive obligations are not now recognized in legal systems, they ought to be recognized. They should be recognized. Okay? Well, the law, okay? Which level of the law are we going to deal with? There are different levels of legal argument. There's international law, and then there's the question of the national jurisdiction, right? Brazil or South Africa, right? And there have been some developments. I'm not sure about the Brazilian law. You could tell me more. But in South Africa, for example, the Constitutional Court has quite recently recognized that non-state actors like corporations can have positive obligations from the Constitution. The question, though, is internationally relevant. So international law is vital here. So I'm not going to make an argument in one jurisdiction. But of course, at the international level, there are weak mechanisms for enforcement. In the limited time I have today, I will not focus on a detailed positivist legal argument. Okay, I'm not going to take you through legal provisions or try and make a detailed argument in international law. I'm going to take you through the general principles involved. Okay, what I'm going to provide is, as I mentioned to you, an analytical framework for determining the substantive content of corporate obligations in relation to fundamental rights. This presentation is based on my forthcoming book, Fundamental Rights and the Legal Obligations of Business. I'm just busy copy editing it, and it will hopefully be out in this later part of the year, hopefully around October. And some of the ideas that I'm sketching today here are more developed in the book. So hopefully you'll get to look at that a little bit more detail. Okay. So let's start with the foundational argument, because you need to understand this foundational argument to move further, right? Fundamental rights are ultimately in law rooted in dignity. What is dignity? Dignity is a commitment to the value of every individual, at least of humans, but maybe beyond humans. Dignity involves, if you have dignity, it means that one must treat someone as if they have value. And to treat someone as if they have value requires respecting their foundational interests. And those foundational interests, like in freedom, in housing, in resources, certain resources, are protected by fundamental rights. Okay? Now, one important thing to remember is that fundamental rights are articulated from the perspective of beneficiaries or victims. If I have a right to life, my interest is that my life is preserved and protected, right? So the right to life is articulated from the perspective of the rights holder, right? Fundamental rights are agnostic as to who has the obligations. It could be the state, it could be companies, it could be other individuals. And so ultimately the question is, if I have a right to life, who has the obligation to ensure I am able to live, right? And the question is, how do we allocate those obligations? And so the framework for the allocation of obligations, for the determination of the content of obligations, is one that involves what I call a multifactorial approach. It involves different factors, 6 or 7 here are outlined, and then an overarching evaluation, normative evaluation. The first set of factors are what I call right holder factors or beneficiary factors, and they are interest, vulnerability, impact. And then there are agent relative factors. Those are from the perspective of the obligation holder, and that relates to capacity, function, autonomy, other actors, and an overarching evaluation. I am going to explain more about this, so don't worry if you don't understand what I'm talking about right now. but you'll see how it applies to our question. Okay, what is the defense of this framework? Well, as I said, I don't have time to go into it in detail here, but the framework is drawn from an analysis of various court decisions around the world relating to corporate and other non-state actor obligations. And my approach draws out and systematizes existing practice. The framework identifies the relevant normative factors, and the framework gives expression to normative complexity. Not all the factors, importantly, pull in the same direction. We'll see that. It is a context-specific framework, and it allows for the incremental development of our understanding of positive obligations, which is a positive thing, given that this is such a question at the moment in the international community and is at the early stages of discussion, right? So we are discussing something that's relatively cutting edge. And the framework provides a structured mode of reasoning to reach conclusions about the substantive content of corporate obligations. So let's go into the framework a little bit, because that will give you a sense of what I'm talking about, not just at such an abstract level. So the first factor we need to consider is the interest underlying the right, or the right that's affected. And here we have to start by considering, from the perspective of the rights holder, what are the issues at stake, right? And relating to COVID, that's obviously multiple ones. There's life itself. There are more than this at the moment. Okay, but 2.6 million. I'm not sure what the numbers are now. Actually, there are healthcare, sickness, long COVID, livelihoods. The International Labour Organization said there's an increase of global unemployment by 33 million and a reduction of labor income of 3.7 trillion US dollars. So the interests are particularly urgent and fundamental. And the principle we can develop here is the more urgent the interests, the stronger the positive obligations, right? Which rights are affected? I'm not going to go into this in detail with you, but we can take, let's say, at the international level, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Every human being has the inherent right to life. And the General Comment 36 has told us that doesn't only include not being killed, it also means that you have to not be deprived of life. And it can also include threats emanating and relate to threats emanating from private persons and entities. Okay. Social rights, the International Covenant on Economic Social Rights, the right to the highest standard of physical and mental health. The state must take all necessary measures to deal with the prevention, treatment, and control of epidemic diseases. The right to an adequate standard of living. Then there are national constitutions. Here I lay out the jurisdiction I know best, South Africa, and the various legal provisions relating to dignity, life, security of the person, healthcare. And I looked at briefly, and you'll know more about the Brazilian constitution, some of the rights therein, such as the right to life and health. Okay, so obviously some of the most important interests that individuals have are affected. Second factor that we need to consider is what I call vulnerability. This is drawn from the Colombian courts, their case law on non-state actor obligations. And they actually very interestingly recognize vulnerability as a very important factor in assessing obligations. The principle is the greater the vulnerability, the greater will be the justification for imposing positive obligations and a greater extent thereof. It requires a contextual understanding of the real power relations at stake. And if we look at our vaccine again, the manufacture and supply of vaccines are in the hands of companies. Individuals are entirely dependent on manufacturers and vulnerable to their power. The intellectual property system gives them a monopoly over exploiting the vaccine, right? And poor countries lack the ability to pay high prices, and their population is entirely vulnerable if they cannot access these vaccines. Okay, so that's how vulnerability would play out in this context. And the last beneficiary-orientated factor is what we might call impact. This requires us to ascertain the concrete impact on the interests of individuals of the lack of action by corporations. The principle here would be the greater the impact, the greater the case for positive obligations that extent. And the failure to provide vaccines universally clearly will lead to deaths of hundreds of thousands more people. It will lead to more sickness and ill health. It will enhance global inequality, undermine jobs. And so the impact is clearly very, very severe. So what about agent relative factors? Remember, these are factors from the perspective of the obligation bearer, the pharmaceutical manufacturers in this instance. Capacity is the flip side of vulnerability and impact. It addresses corporate power. And the principle we can develop is the greater the capacity, the stronger the prima facie obligations. Pharmaceutical manufacturers have the sole power to manufacture and produce these vaccines. Prima facie, they therefore have obligations. But why the qualification? Why only prima facie? If they have the capacity to help, why don't they have obligations automatically? Well, capacity, in my view, cannot be seen as a sufficient condition to determine obligations. It is necessary but not sufficient, because it can potentially place unlimited obligations on powerful corporations and contradict their economic purposes. Okay, so think about Apple, how wealthy Apple is. Does Apple have the obligation to finance vaccine access for all people in Brazil? Right? It's probably not correct to argue that it does. Okay, it also fails to account for the fact that there are multiple actors with capacity. Okay, so it doesn't deal with the problem that there's not only one vaccine manufacturer, there are multiple vaccine manufacturers. And even if Pfizer could provide vaccines for everyone around the world, it seems unfair when there is Moderna who could help do so as well. Okay, so we need capacity is not enough to determine obligations. The second agent relative factor is what we call function, and this has two parts, a general part and a specific part. Okay, and it raises questions concerning the general reasons for the creation of corporations. Now, we can't go into this in detail, but ultimately, even capitalist arguments accept that corporations are created for social benefits. Their limited liability allows, for instance, individuals to take greater risks and therefore to stimulate innovation, which ultimately enhances us all. Okay? And so part of the idea behind the corporation is to harness the power of profit for social benefit, right? To harness the power of pharmaceutical manufacturers to create new drugs. At the same time, it is necessary to ensure an alignment between profit and social benefit. And where urgent social benefits relating to fundamental rights are restricted to the few that can afford them, there is a case for requiring corporations to ensure they are accessible to all. Otherwise, they don't meet their very purpose. There's a second part of function which is more specific, and that relates to the role of the corporation in society and the way this enhances their capacity. Okay? So, and the principle here is if corporations have a specific social function and need in the sphere in which they operate, they will have positive obligations to advance fundamental rights in the sphere. So how does this apply now? Vaccine example, pharmaceutical manufacturers operate in a sector that relates to foundational, constitutional, and international rights. And that is partly what gives them their profitability, right? People and governments will pay a lot to save lives and enhance healthcare, right? So they work to some extent on the basis that people need their services. They specifically decide to operate in an area of pressing social need. And that, I would argue, provides a case for them to have enhanced obligations and to expect them to perform and help others as well. Contrast the function of a pharmaceutical manufacturer with a jewelry company which simply operates in the sphere of luxuries, right? And you can see the difference, what I'm saying, that a pharmaceutical manufacturer may have stronger and more intrusive positive obligations than the jewelry company, which only operates in that sphere. The jewelry company may take on a role to provide watches to a hospital or clocks to a hospital, in which case it would start having a more public type function as well. So the function of a pharmaceutical manufacturer is not obviously a purely private one, where it relates to goods that have a foundational impact on our lives, and there are limited opportunities to access such goods. The third factor in relation to positive obligations, and this pulls in the opposite direction, is what we call autonomy. It recognizes that corporations as constituted today are not simply parts of the state and have their own purposes and goals that flow from those of their shareholders or owners. The shareholders have an economic purpose in setting up the corporation. They didn't create Pfizer and Moderna for altruistic reasons. They wanted to achieve their economic goal, and arguably they're entitled to do so through making profits due to their investments in a society in which we believe in freedom. So the principle here is the greater impact on autonomy of the individual and derivatively the corporation, the greater justification will be needed for onerous positive obligations. And this factor will tend to reduce what we require of corporations and individuals. An important distinction in relation to autonomy is a distinction between restrictions on autonomy and the obliteration of it. So there is a big difference between forcing the reduction in profit and rendering the company itself a loss-making entity. And we'll see that plays a role in what I think ultimately should happen. What about other actors? This is the last factor in relation to positive obligations. And this is a very important one I raised before earlier, that there may be many people who can provide. Consider a homeless person in your neighborhood. It need not fall on only one person to provide, but all the people who live in the area to provide. Okay? So which actors have obligations and how do we divide them up between the actors? The first division we need to consider is the state-corporation nexus. States have duties here as well, but have effectively outsourced manufacturing to the pharmaceutical companies. And so there is a question as to whether this should be the case, but that is the world we live in now. And pharmaceutical companies therefore have a unique position in relation to supply, and it cannot be therefore the obligation of the state alone to provide. We also need to consider other private actors, right? And there may be a shared obligation amongst pharmaceutical companies that have patents over vaccines proportional to their capacity. So it will not fall on Pfizer alone, but on Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and all the other companies to make their vaccine accessible and to supply if all have effective vaccines. And obviously there's a question mark at the moment about some vaccines that are originating from China at least. Okay, so there will be a need for some coordination of provisioning amongst these various companies as well to avoid duplication and inefficiency. Okay, that's a very important aspect of positive obligations. Now, morally, there may be other private obligations as well on other actors like non-governmental organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières. If they have the capacity to assist, they may have some obligations to help. There may be philanthropists like the Gates Foundation that can help procure vaccines. So there is a range of actors who may have obligations in this area, though pharmaceutical companies will have special obligations given their function. So we have all these factors we need to consider. How do we reach a conclusion? Well, this is quite a complex question. I'm going to simplify it here. And it requires evaluating, I would argue, the serious harms to rights against the burdens on the non-state actor. It requires an identification of alternatives and ensuring the realization of rights occurs with not too severe and intrusive an impact on the non-state party. So let's consider the various possibilities I raised earlier. Okay, let's say pharmaceutical companies have an obligation to provide the drug for free, essentially, or the vaccine for free. This would essentially be, I would suggest, a form of nationalization of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Okay, now there's another debate as to whether that's a good thing or not. I'm not going to take a position there, but nevertheless, that is what it would account to. It places the whole burden on pharmaceutical companies. It completely ignores the autonomy components and their nature as a private corporation. Now, maybe we shouldn't have private corporations providing medicines and vaccines, but that's the world we live in and that we've decided to allow it. And it could possibly also have negative effects by destroying the incentives to produce better drugs or vaccines in the future. So unless there's no other way, I would suggest it would be preferable to consider alternative approaches. Okay, because whilst there are very strong factors in favor of the rights holder, this is very intrusive on the obligation bearer. And so we should maybe consider whether there's another alternative. What about providing the vaccine at an affordable rate, including different prices for different countries depending on their ability to afford? That would address the urgent interests of beneficiaries. It places some obligations on states to the extent they are capable. It doesn't let them off the hook. States also have an obligation. It's not just pharmaceutical companies. And it places some obligations on other private actors to assist, right? And it requires a reduction in the profits of pharmaceutical manufacturing, but it doesn't nationalize them. It doesn't obliterate their profits. It doesn't render them loss-making entities, okay? I would suggest to you this alternative should be required by fundamental rights law. Constitutions and international law should be understood to require the provision of these vaccines at an affordable rate. What about the second issue we discussed about expanding supply? Well, it is critical at the moment. One of the biggest problems is there's a lack of supply, and we need to meet beneficiary interests and help end the pandemic globally. The longer the virus is able the more it poses risks that there will be a variant the vaccines don't control. So it would be sensible to share out the burden of supply amongst pharmaceutical manufacturers. Pfizer alone cannot produce all the vaccines that are necessary, even those without intellectual property, right? And so this may reduce, again, the profit of each pharmaceutical manufacturer. It reduces their monopoly, but it still recognizes their autonomy interests, okay? I would suggest a better approach is to allow them to license the right to make this vaccine to other pharmaceutical manufacturers for a fee. So each of the companies has an incentive to produce it, and they are able to benefit in some ways that would be consistent with the current system. The alternative is what's often called compulsory licensing, in which the government would force them to provide the IP to other companies. I think that's also justifiable, by the way. The better alternative, the less intrusive one, would be licensing for a fee. And these would be required by law and help us end this pandemic. So why is the world not, in fact, recognizing this, right? So I've taken you through a reasoning process, right? Pharmaceutical companies are not just private entities that can make profits as they like. They control vital life-saving medications that affect individual lives and health. The COVID-19 vaccination is one of those very, very important pharmaceutical developments. They remain non-state entities, though, in the current model, okay? And so fundamental rights can deal with both aspects by requiring two things, I suggest to you: accessible and differential pricing, and expanding supply quickly and efficiently to root out the disease by loosening intellectual property protections, okay? And as I've mentioned to you, more development of these ideas, because we could only do so much in this seminar, and I want to leave time for questions, is in my book, Fundamental Rights and the Legal Obligations of Business, and that will hopefully be out later in the year. Okay, so I'm going to leave my remarks there. I hope that has been interesting and taken you through a way of thinking about these things, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the discussants about these, about your thoughts about what I've said, and also taking some questions.
So thank you very much, Professor. It was a very enlightening presentation with very fundamental considerations on the subject, and I'm sure it raised several questions among our participants. I thank also my colleagues from outside Brazil for their solidarity, above all, with our current scenario. I'm just going to introduce my remarks, and I'll invite my colleagues to join us with their questions. So I'll start the crisis with itself. So the crisis we are experiencing with COVID-19 around the world seems to have shown how the world is in terms of collaboration and a sense of social responsibility. So in the human rights language, the state has often arranged their own affairs in a way that is detrimental to access to vaccines in other countries, in spite of their extraterritorial legal obligations to, at very least, avoid their actions that would result in the impairment of the human rights of people outside their own territories. So a story of epidemics describes that epidemics are a category of disease that seem to hold up the mirror to human beings as to who we really are. So in terms of the access to vaccines, we do also have a problem concerning inequality. The crisis we are experiencing with COVID-19 around the world seems to have shown how split we are, and vaccines are badly required by the world, and medical equipment like ventilators and oxygen concentrators. In a large number of countries, particularly low and middle income ones, are struggling to access vaccines, drugs, and equipment. So there cannot be a more important occasion than the current circumstances for issuing compulsory licenses for producing patented health products. So this crisis also underpins the importance of flexible global trade rules. This explains why rich and higher income countries have been much more ahead of others in obtaining vaccines and inoculating their people, and instead of solving it, it deepens the situation of inequality. So in this context, Professor, do you think that the corporate obligation to buy and provide access to vaccines is actually also a smart way to escape from an even more problematic discussion about intellectual property and compulsory licenses and the flexibilization of the TRIPS agreement?
Do you want me to answer now, or do you want to have it as a dialogue, or how do you want to do it, Victoria?
I think if you feel comfortable, Professor, we can start a round of remarks, and after a remark, if you feel comfortable to make your considerations, we can keep going.
Okay, that's great. So, Victoria, look, you raised question. As you've heard, my presentation, while I think it makes a lot of sense from a commonsensical point of view, it is actually quite today regarded as quite radical, right, in our world today, that companies should have such obligations. Now, you've raised the question of the interrelationship between fundamental rights questions about positive obligations and intellectual property. I think they are two different areas of law in some ways, but the one relates to the other, right? And in a sense, what I'm suggesting to you around positive obligations from fundamental rights are more foundational questions. They're foundational questions about what we regard as obligations on private actors and how we conceptualize the what the legal rules are going to be, what are permissions we're going to give to companies to, for example, exploit the drugs they develop. Now, I'm not against completely the intellectual property system, right? I think many of us believe that, you know, we produce products and we want to, the intellectual property system may give incentives to people. It may provide protections for people to control their own, the production of their own labor. Right. But as with generally property, right, and I think intellectual property is a species of property, property rights should never have been conceptualized as absolute in any way. Property rights are one form of right which has some normative consequence, but that doesn't mean that they outweigh other forms of rights at all. And we need to consider, and that has been accepted at the WTO level. So essentially during the HIV/AIDS crisis, it was essentially accepted that that there would be flexibilities in the WTO rules around intellectual property to allow countries to, for example, issue compulsory licenses when serious health issues are at stake. And so in a way that has been accepted, but it's been very difficult to implement. And global North countries like the United States and the European Union have placed huge obstacles in the face of governments actually taking advantage of these flexibilities. We saw recently an incredible development in that Joe Biden has supported the waiver of intellectual property rights potentially at the WTO level. And at the moment, to their shame, it is the European Union who is standing in the way of a waiver to enable greater supply across the world. So, I think there needs to be a lot of pressure on European Union, on France and Germany, which are somehow standing in the way of that development at the moment. But the existing legal framework does allow for it, and it gives expression to the notion that a corporation may have its own domain in which it can, in a sense, exploit its own innovations, but there are limits on that domain. And when it comes to affecting the fundamental interests of others and where they operate in areas like healthcare, which are so important and so fundamental, then they actually may have a duty actually to even provide the technology around their own innovations to others to enable access across the world. One would hope corporations would want to do that, but we see that's not something they generally do just want to do. Okay, so I hope, it's an interesting and fascinating question you ask about the relationship between these two domains, but I hope I've given you a response about the relationship, I think, between rights and the rules that are developed in intellectual property.
So thank you so much for your consideration, Professor. It's a very challenging situation. And I think maybe Daniela and João would like to present their own remarks too.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us today. I would just make a quick point, actually. I would rather pass on to Sophia and Marin, who I believe have their own points to make as well. My only concern actually relates to, it's a bit technical, but relates to international framework of obligations, which usually requires states to enforce private obligations from companies, which adds, I think, additional layer of difficulty to all the debates. So I'll point this to add to debate a little bit of the problematic in light of the realistic policy and global governance issues between states and corporations in an international level.
Yeah.
But if I may, I think it would be better if we put on the other questions and then set up a little bit more room to discuss and then finalize it. So if Gustavo and Sophia and João could pose your remarks.
Okay, you did raise an important issue about the state framework, but I'm happy to take more questions and I'll address your question after.
Okay. So maybe Gustavo?
Okay, thank you. Maybe João will talk first, no? Am I wrong about it?
Gustavo, please, I think we can turn to you now.
Okay.
Okay.
No problem. Okay. Well, at first, I'd like to thank Professor Bilchitz, and thanks for being with us to discuss matters that are not just relevant, but urgent, especially in a country like ours, which is one of the most affected ones by the pandemic. I had the opportunity to take a brief reading in text of the professor, and they are really interesting, and I would like to pose some questions that raised during my opportunity to read them. Professor, I'd like to start, if you excuse me, with a question like off-label, and I say off-label on purpose because of what I might ask. I mean, not related to vaccines, point one, and maybe not related to positive obligations, but rather negative obligations. And by this, I want to talk about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. The question would be, can we speak of a negative duty of the pharmaceutical industry regarding the massive sale of drugs without proven efficacy off-label to governments whose actions are massively infringing fundamental rights? And this is an interpretation of mine, but I would like to credit a study that is in development in the business and human rights of University of São Paulo group, especially by the researcher Gabriele Duarte, in partnership with Professor Saad Nis, in which they analyze the attitude of Brazilian government regarding the massive distribution of these medicines without scientific proof of efficacy. And I mean, there is this legal argument that it's just a neutral action. If you want to buy, I can sell you. You don't use that just for COVID. You shouldn't use it for COVID, actually, right? So, okay, I'm just selling. But the point is, you are, with this, I call neutral action, you are giving supply to a narrative that might have harmed several thousands of people in our country. What's the responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry regarding that, including analyzing possible parallels with other cases of supply in other industries regarding, for example, authoritarian regimes and what they needed to implement their public policies? That's a question that took my mind when I read your text. I have some more to pose, if you allow me, and if the group allow me. And when I heard your brilliant explanation, actually, but I really had this doubt, and I was talking to my colleague Daniela these days, that what raised my concern is about how to make it concrete and make it operational in a global governance framework. That's and by that I don't mean just a normative framework, but really a realpolitik framework. I mean, if I can make it more concrete, how to operationalize this necessary global governance that seems to be in the basis of your ideas, if I'm not wrong. I believe the professor said something about companies having a relevant role as actors in this arrangement, which is necessary. And that also makes me ask, what's the role of the interaction between states and corporations in this international arrangement, in this definition? And especially since some companies have revenues greater than the gross domestic products of many of the countries that most need supply of these vaccines and that most need differentiated prices, right? And I take as an example two different cases in the States here, right? In one side, countries that accumulate vaccines, perhaps even at levels that are higher than they really need. That might be the case of the United States, I'm not affirming. And others that neglected the purchase of vaccines. And I say that in Brazil, this hypothesis of a deliberate neglect is under investigation by our Congress right now, right? So two different positions, and how do we accommodate it? Basically, are we working also with the need for a paternalistic orientation towards states? I mean, and how to make it enforceable, especially regarding these two opposite attitudes. One that accumulates, the other one that says no. And in Brazil, it's under investigation, but we have the suspicion that the government might have taken several months to give an answer to a simple letter or an email, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the question is how is to make this operational in an international framework, considering this asymmetry between states, between companies, and some states that might need this these products the most, and how to make it without this human rights treaty, which might be necessary, but we do not have time because people are dying right now. how to make it enforceable with the framework and the normative framework we already have. I mean, I have more questions, but I don't want to take time of my colleagues, and I would be really glad to hear from you, Professor. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and I would like to thank also the organization of the event. I'll not say name by name, but to everybody who helped to organize this opportunity. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Gustavo. Should I jump in? Because I know some other people want to ask, but you've asked a lot of questions, so I need to engage with them. And then before I've written notes, but I may not. Yeah, so I'll try and cover most of them, but also allow people a chance to do it. So firstly, I think about like vaccine efficacy. I think that's what you were raising about. And do you have a duty not to promote negative information about vaccines, false information, or allow for the release of vaccines? As you've said correctly, I mean, we cannot think of these. The obligations of the pharmaceutical companies are obligations of the state are related, right? So we need to think of, there are state obligations to ensure, for example, a vaccine is efficacious, right? I am not sure why any country, frankly, I mean, I'm making a big statement here, but I cannot understand why any country has allowed the Chinese vaccine to be put in people's arms without proper published studies. That seems to me to be completely negligent and outrageous, right? You have to have followed proper protocols to be able to see, according to the best scientific standards, to see that something is effective or not. Now, if it's effective, I have nothing to say that the Chinese vaccine may be effective. They're two, actually. They may be effective, but they have to go according to the right standards, and that needs to be done globally. And it's very dangerous to allow for, because you can actually land up having. Firstly, you harm the vaccines that are actually efficacious, right? Because people then stop having trust in any of the vaccines. And secondly, you may actually cause dire harms to people, right? By putting things into their bodies which may not be good. So the reality is there is an obligation, obviously, on states to ensure the proper processes are followed and that they are considered, okay? And there need to be obligations on the part of companies to ensure that they go through those processes and they meet all the protocols that are required. Okay, so there's two parts on that issue. And there would be similar questions around information. You cannot put false information out about vaccines, etc. And there may be restrictions on freedom of expression related to that, right? We see a lot of nonsense going on around vaccines, which there may be legitimate reasons to restrict that in some cases. Okay, so as you've said, that's why we cannot think of this as just positive or negative obligations. We have to think of the different suite of obligations that relate to the question of COVID-19 vaccines. I took a very specific question. In a way, I took the hardest question, which is what obligations do pharmaceuticals companies have to provide or actively to reduce prices, etc., which is perhaps the most controversial question in this field. But what you said is correct, that there are many, many different aspects which need to be considered. You asked a question about operationalizing this. How do we make positive obligations real? Well, I mean, there are a range of different things. As you've said, the Business and Human Rights Treaty is at the moment, as you probably read, I'm a strong proponent of it. I think we need a treaty to govern corporations and their relationship with fundamental rights. The current treaty has been watered down a lot. It will still be a good treaty, but nevertheless, it isn't as ambitious as it could be. And I think global South countries should be pushing for a much stronger treaty in some ways, etc. But as you've said, that won't help us in an emergency situation. So the emergency situation, I mean, to some extent, we have to rely on existing frameworks. The World Health Organization did set up something called the COVAX facility, which you followed, which, if wealthy countries had to donate for every vaccine they give to one member of their people, they have to donate one to COVAX. And pharmaceutical companies, for every vaccine they sell, they have to donate one to COVAX. You would start getting a huge supply of vaccines, which could be distributed across the world to other countries. So I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I'm suggesting to you that it's not none of this is impossible, we need to also, and many of you are in early stages of your careers and legal careers, and I think that's quite important, is to kind of analyze, why have we set the world up in the way it's been set up? Because some of these things look like intellectual property and all these things, they look like they are just features of the way the world is, but they're not. They're human constructions, right? There are things we can't do anything about. We can't do anything about that a virus developed and now is going around the world. We maybe could have stopped it early on, but at the moment we can't do anything about it, right? But what we can do something about is actually ensure that all the human structures we have help fight that virus as best as we can, and the biggest one involved is the vaccine. So as I said, there are lots of possibilities there. COVAX, we need to reduce intellectual property protection through various mechanisms. I've suggested to you, ideally companies should themselves license other companies, but if not, we should go for compulsory licensing. We need to, and so there are a range of different, and in human rights law, we need to ensure that in constitutions, in constitutional law, there's a recognition that you could actually claim something from these companies. Okay, but as you've said, it's a global question. And the last issue you raised, I think, is vaccine accumulation, and also neglect, right? So obviously, I mean, these are more about state obligations, right? States have an obligation not to be unfairly accumulate vaccines and to ensure that there's a distribution around the world. They already have those obligations in international human rights law, arguably in around duties of international cooperation and assistance, relating to some of the international treaties. And obviously neglect. I mean, South Africa is also dealing with this. The government seems to have woken up very late about the vaccine, and is only starting to roll out very slowly now, which will have an impact on people's lives, right? So, that is a failure on the government's part in relation to vaccines. It's not so easy so it's easy to find a failure. The problem is how to solve it, right? And the solution is not so simple, because now a lot of countries have put in orders in the global north, and now the global south is really way behind. So the only solution I can think of really is for an increase in global supply of vaccines very quickly. I mean, vaccines take a while to produce, right? So it's not, and there are many component parts, so it's not all that simple, right? But as soon as is possible, there needs to be every single manufacturer that has the capability, whether in Brazil, whether in India, whether in South Africa, needs to get involved in doing this and trying to move vaccines into people as soon as possible, provided, as we said, they are safe and efficacious. Okay, so I think I've dealt with yours. I think that in some ways, to some extent, I dealt with Daniela's point as well, because of the relationship between the state and corporations. Daniela, you are right that at the international level, actually, the way it's generally been understood is that states have a duty to protect individuals against harms by corporations, or to impose obligations on corporations. But that doesn't take away anything from what I've said, because if you accept what I said, that corporations have obligations, then you simply say that states have the duty to impose those obligations in their own systems and at the international level. So I dislike the indirect approach, because I think we should go directly to the actor, and I think human rights imply that all actors can have obligations, but I don't have a problem with, if you want to do it through the state, then do it through the state, right? Then just simply say, well, corporations have these obligations, and the body that needs to impose them is the state, and the states need to agree at an international level to impose them. That's the way around to deal with the state duty to protect doctrine. As I said, I think we should challenge that doctrine. I think we should recognize that corporations have direct obligations under international law, and in fact within constitutional systems like Brazil. I'm not sure what your doctrine is in Brazil. I know that in Colombia they have actions. You can take a tutela contra particulares against particular individuals, right? You can in South Africa you can also do that against private entities. These are all possibilities that can exist there. Okay, let's make room for a few more questions. I said that I would be able to go. I know we said initially an hour. I said I was happy to go until about 75 minutes, so up to about quarter past the hour, next hour. Okay, great.
So if I may, guys, does anyone have anything to say, or can I just make one of my many questions I have here?
Jump in.
Please, Sophia.
So first, thank you all. Thank you, Victoria, João, Daniela, and Gustavo, for being here with me. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Professor David, for being here with us. And usually, after such a great presentation, I get more doubts than certainties. So I think it's fair to say that I will try my hardest to be precise here about my thoughts. But here you provide us with a very specific approach on pharmaceutical companies, and we were addressing positive rights. But I had the opportunity to read one of the books. You've been an author and editor, The Human Rights Obligations of Business.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look back in history, I think it's fair to say that corporations have played a greater and greater role, not only regarding the social appearance of operational labor, so these really specific infrastructural functions that we see in our daily basis, but also in framing the whole legal context of human rights principles and rules, so to say. But here, I think it was the very first time. I'm not really a specialist in human rights. I'm studying actually right to food and matters related to food fraud that also deal with industry, but not so in this broad approach that you brought us here. And I think it's fair for me to say that it was the very first time that I saw a presentation that brought me an outline, a framework, and how to address such duties, such responsibilities on the side of corporations. So we have here criteria that provide us what would be the content, what would be fair to say it is a corporation's duty. So you talk about capacity, function, autonomy, interest, vulnerability, impact. And those criteria, of course, they make more tangible, more concrete, how we can actually make corporations accountable. But I have this little bug here by my side telling me that maybe we should think this really particular situation from a further perspective. Maybe because you are specifically talking, once again, I think my questions may rely out of the scope here, but I think it is an important one because we are talking specifically about pharmaceutical corporations, but we have undoubtedly, it's out of a question that we have also really great transnational and multinational corporations that could play a role in making vaccines accessible, because it's not only the price of the vaccine, it is also the price of the raw materials. It's also the price of the chairs that people have to sit to receive the vaccination. It's also the price for cotton. It's also the price for vaccination campaigns, for infrastructure in general. So what I'm trying here to say is, I'm giving a Brazilian example, specifically Brazilian example. We have here one of the greatest corporations for beverages, that's Ambev. And I think it's also fair to say that they have maybe one of the largest distribution chains here that could provide the maybe sufficient infrastructure to deliver vaccination here. So, of course, they are not healthily rated. They are not a healthily related company. They are selling beer mostly. But wouldn't it be fair to say that they at least should provide some help regarding distribution of vaccines here in Brazil, especially considering that they are a Brazilian company and make greater profit here, and this would maybe relate to the moral fundamentals of human rights. I think that would be the main conclusion of my thoughts here. And so I just, this one was a really long explanation. I have two more questions. They will be really straightforward. So we have here also greater problem, a major discussion on whether private corporations should buy vaccines and start vaccination in their own body instead of relying on our universal health system here that we call SUS. So this created a really heating argument on both sides, those one in favor, those against it, saying that they would create a second line of vaccination. And this would therefore provide not only a competitor to the national health system here in Brazil, because then we would have multiple players trying to acquire what would be scarce material, but then it would have also the matter of accountability in general. So I would like some of your insights, your thoughts on that matter, especially considering that from as far as I know, this was not a worldwide measure. So it would be something really specific here in Brazil. And to just to you know, give the opportunity for the other people here to make their appointments. I would just like for you to comment a little bit more. I think that Gustavo tried to address that matter, and I would put it in a really raw way. That is, would corporations have duties not because of the state, but despite of the state? Because here in Brazil, we are discussing, as Gustavo mentioned, we are facing an investigation. The parliament is investigating the executive power for some of their actions. And the thing is, we have this massive national communication on the benefits of a precautionary use of some medicines that until now have no proof of working or in any matter, not for preventing COVID, for treating COVID, but of course, the pharmaceutical companies are facing great profits. I think that one of the medicines have faced more than 1,000% increase in sales here in Brazil. And despite that, it took really long for this company to make a formal statement saying this medicine does not work for COVID. And as far as I can say, as far as I've seen, they did not take any concrete measure in making a anti-propaganda of this use. So please, I would like some comments on that too.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good questions and interesting questions, and engaging with exactly the framework that I've laid out. So the first question, you know, it relates to one of the problems in positive obligations, right? Is that you have so many different entities that can actually realize obligations. I focused on one part, and as you correctly say, I focused on making enough vaccines and making the vaccines not out of the reach of people across the world. As you've said, there's a multiple layers there, and there are many other corporations who may have specific functions and therefore would also have specific duties, like making the vials of the vaccine, some of the raw materials for those kind of things. They would also have specific duties similar to the ones I've mentioned. You raised an interesting question about a corporation that doesn't work within the area of health, and what are its obligations, right? And so, as I've said to you, I divided the division between general function and specific function. I couldn't do this in detail, but in general, I think that those in the specific area will have to deliver and have the strongest obligations relating to their specific area of focus. However, where that's not possible to deliver the goods, it's where it's not possible to, for example, as you say, to get things across Brazil, which is a very big country, right? Then we need to consider what are the various other possibilities. Now, one possibility, the best possibility, let's say, for vaccines would be the state infrastructure, right? That would be the best. But my assumption is Brazil, like South Africa, does not have a great state infrastructure, and that in some parts it's good, in some parts it's bad, and that maybe in Sao Paulo, where you guys are, it's all good, in Rio, but in parts of the country, it's not very good and not accessible. And that there may be countries which have companies which have very strong logistics, which can, in fact, assist in the development of their vaccine. My framework would allow for the imposition on companies like AB InBev of some obligations like that, but it would have to consider all the actors in the area and who would be best placed to be able to assist in these circumstances, right? It's also got an incredible power, so it probably wouldn't be affected very much by having these obligations in any case, right? So, but at the same time, we need to be very careful about taking any corporation, for example, and imposing obligations on it completely out of line with what it's got capacity for, because you may get negative effects. So AB InBev, which does nothing relating to vaccines, may not have any proper hygienic ways, may not understand how to ensure vaccines are distributed properly, and then you can actually cause negative harm to people, right? And you can, for example, I mean, the vaccine may not be stored properly, and then it's not effective, and various other kinds of things. So I can see there being various issues. You have to be very careful. My framework doesn't prevent allowing those kinds of companies to have obligations, but they will be what I call residual obligations, right? They won't be the primary obligations. Okay. The second issue that you raised was about private health insurance and like a private stream of vaccine access, right? Now, look, the human rights principles, the fundamental rights principles will require that every individual is treated equally, right? And everyone is equally able to access vaccines, right? That is irrespective of whether you're poor or wealthy, right? There wouldn't necessarily in COVID-19 situations, I don't think, be a good case for necessarily treating poor people better than wealthy people, except there may be a case that poor people are more vulnerable because they live in conditions where the spread of the vaccine is more likely. So people who have separate homes, bigger homes, they're able to separate out, may lead vaccines to be less likely. So that may be a case, right? That for poorer people to be given priority. So that's an interesting issue. It hasn't been done anywhere in the world, okay? Ultimately, the question is, what is the best way in which to treat everyone equally in their access to vaccines? Certainly, you can't give people, because they can afford private health insurance, greater priority over those who can't afford private health insurance. On the other hand, you may well think that private health insurance can be part of the solution in distributing vaccines alongside the government, and that actually placing the whole obligation on the government will not be efficient, right? So it seems to me that there may be a role, I call this a collaborative approach. So many people think of it as the state or the corporation, but what about the state and the corporation? What about the two working together? What about the private health insurance working with the government? And in South Africa, one of the things that a private health insurance company has been required to do is that for every vaccine it gives to its members, it subsidizes one vaccine to the public sector, okay? So that's a very clever use of private sector monetary power, okay? And these are kinds of things that you can utilize and harness. And I think, and so again, it doesn't become, right, a corporation versus the state. They're the ones that have all the obligations. It's about trying to see how best to ensure that everyone is provided for, okay? And I think the last one I've kind of covered in relation to Gustavo's question, but I think basically the answer in my view is that corporations clearly have positive duties to make clear to people whether the drugs they develop are efficacious against any particular disease like COVID or not. And obviously they can't be responsible for false information. And the problem in Brazil, right? I mean, I don't want to get into too much politics, but my reading, I don't know your politics well, but my reading is you've actively had a president who was denialist initially and essentially has actively played a role in preventing solutions to the problem, right? So you have a real problem where you have a state that is actually actively going against people's best interests. What you need to do there is you need a number of things, right? You need the courts, you need cases to be brought in court to slap him down and prevent him from doing the kinds of things that he's doing. I don't know whether the courts have done that. And the second thing that you need is you can have, and one of the main cases for positive obligations in some of the literature is when the state fails, private sector has to step in. So you've raised that as the possibility. And here you've in a sense got a very strong example of state failure in Brazil, at least at the executive level. And therefore you may have greater positive obligations on companies as a result because of the failure of the state, right? And that's similar to, you can think of other countries, like in some parts of Africa, mining companies take over the provision of schooling and healthcare hospitals, right? In some parts of Africa, because the state can't provide it and they take over those obligations, they then have to continue to provide those services, right? And so in a similar vein here, in the case of Brazil, in my view, the private sector probably had stronger obligations and still and does have, because my understanding is your presidential election is next year, I think, right? So the chance to get rid of someone like this is not there, and therefore you need other sectors of society to step in to address the failures of governance and not put people's lives at risk.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Professor David Bilchitz. If I could add just a quick question, I would say, I would question you about the positive duty that states could have regarding the vaccination of our native peoples. The federal government has made a strong case about addressing medicines not scientifically validated, which led to immense victimization in the Amazon basin. What are your thoughts on that? Could we address this problem as an issue of vulnerability and affordability to the native peoples? What could be a framework for preventing this immense victimization in a post-COVID world? Thank you very much, Professor.
Joe, before I answer you, I need to know more because I don't know the situation. Tell me more about why have people been victimized? What has been the background of that?
Okay, so let me add some more thoughts about that. The federal government has made the case that providing medicines that were not scientifically validated. So some medicines like hydroxychloroquine, right, or ivermectin. I don't know if that is the English translation, but hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, there were medicines that were not validated scientifically, which led to immense victimization in the Amazon basin. We have a strong concentration of native peoples, native indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin, and thus our federal government and also state governments have made a very bad judgment about what would be the best framework for addressing the prevention of COVID-19 infections to these peoples. And so our most vulnerable people, our indigenous peoples that live in this region, were victimized, acquiring. So the main consequence was higher mortality rates that as a consequence of this misleading on federal and state governments. So
okay, so what are you saying to me, that they were given medicines that were not approved properly. Is that what you mean by victimization?
Exactly.
That had not been scientifically proved. Well, I mean, look, this is obviously completely unacceptable, right? I mean, you can't just look. In a pandemic, people are very desperate, right? We all were desperate, right? Because we see a terrible thing happening, and people want to try and find what's going on, right? But of course, the taking something like something that doesn't work can be worse for you. It can actually actively harm you than actually just trying to social distance and not contract the disease in the first place. So so there may be a case for protocols which allow for emergency approval of certain drugs, but they have to still be scientifically validated protocols, right? They cannot be protocols that allow for any drug to go out and then for people to actively be harmed. So, and the notion of using people who are particularly vulnerable, like indigenous peoples, to experiment on them, that is absolutely awful. It's clearly against any fundamental rights. I mean, it goes against the most basic fundamental rights. It is completely unacceptable. And whether it's the state or pharmaceutical companies, that is something that should, never have been allowed and shouldn't have been done. And obviously, if it has been done, which you're saying it is, then there needs to be possible claims of compensation for those who've been harmed. So, yeah. So, I mean, that's my view on that.
So, Professor, the high level of the debate raised a lot of questions in the chat, but if I may, I would present just the quick and last one remark from Julia. Unfortunately, if you agree, we can gather all the unanswered questions, and after that, we will address later. And in the chat, she asked us about the phenomenon of vaccine tourism. She says that she thinks about something that we are seeing a lot here, especially between Brazil and the USA, the vaccine tourism, where people somehow circumvent the immigration rules and enter in the American territory to get the vaccine already available to tourists, while we see people literally dying without air in many Brazilian states and burning on fires in India. And she asks, what do you think about it? How do you read this phenomenon resulting from a discoordination between domestic strategies?
You know what? I don't think this is I think to me, this is an individual moral, ethical question of whether an individual should or shouldn't, take advantage of their economic resources to be able to get a vaccine, and the reality is I don't think it addresses, it's not really a reality at the social level at all, right? Because the social level, there are a few individuals, I don't know, 1,000, 100,000 people, a maximum, I mean, I don't know, in Brazil who got to the US. This doesn't really address most people's need for the vaccine, right? Most of you can't go to the US to get a vaccine. So whether it's moral or not, it's probably immoral, but I'm not sure for me that it's it is an individual moral question. It's not a question ultimately of, you can say whether the United States should allow people or shouldn't allow people to get vaccines who come in. But the reality is that I'm not sure this goes at all to our topic, right? Which is about how to ensure vaccines across the world are accessible to people. And yes, wealthy people, sadly, are in more powerful positions and will use their power to do better for themselves, right? That is just a reality of the way the world is. We may not like it, but we need to try and solve the problem for the vast majority of people, right? Which is that there has to be supply of vaccine, and there has to be accessibility to the vaccine in terms of and where they are, right? Most people can't travel to another country. So it seems to me, I don't want to take away from the question of Julia, because I think it's a interesting question to debate morally, but it isn't related to the question about corporations' access or who has positive obligations, etc. So I don't want to get into that in more detail here, but it's worth having a moral debate about it. But yeah.
So thank you. Thank you so much, Professor David. Thank you for the great debate with so many challenging questions that certainly will improve our understanding of corporate obligations towards health. And thank you all for participating. It was a really great presentation that raises important reflections on this topic. In the name of the Business and Human Rights Working Group, we thank you so much for the presentation and remarks on the topic of vaccines, corporations, and COVID-19. I just want to mention that we have a lot of webinars that are going on. The next one, we're going to be in this Friday with Professor Laura Inigo, and we look forward to have all of you there too. I would like to thank you all for your participants and to join us in this first webinar. Thank you all again, Professor David.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and good luck with your seminar series, and all the best, and I hope you all stay healthy, and soon you will have access to vaccines across Brazil. So take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Bilchitz. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.